Xlite does produce log files. They're not exhaustive. We don't log everything, and over time we've increasingly logged things, particularly unusual situations. Generally, we tell you when something goes wrong, but there are some times when it's just not practical to tell you something's gone wrong. So in the middle of a render routine, which is running in a background thread, it's not really possible or desirable for us to pop a message up and tell you that something's happened. Or maybe it's just an unusual circumstance and we think that we should log it so that if someone complains, we at least know what's been going on. So your log files, as you'd all be familiar, you get to via the tools and the view log, which will open up in your default text editor the log file. Now I'm going to actually switch over though to Notepad++. And I'm also using a log file from someone who's had a crash. So a lot of it is just GUMP. We log when we start, we log when we exit, we log the details of your machine. That way, when you send us a debug report, we know what sort of machine it was running on. We log a lot during startup because we've had problems in the past during startup where things didn't quite start properly, and so we have a tendency to log that sort of stuff. We also log all of your options. So in the settings menu, there's a whole bunch of options that you can set. We log all of those out as well, so we know what's going on. You'll notice most of these log levels are debug or info. Admittedly, we don't really apply this very religiously. Generally, they're one and the same. So a debug message is just a detailed message. As is info. When you get to warning or warn, it's WARN, or error or crit for critical, they're the things that you need to worry about because that usually means something's gone wrong. Whenever an autosave occurs, it also logs the fact that the autosave happened and how long it took. When you load a sequence, it will also store the details of what's been loaded. We also load the OpenGL stuff because we've had problems with that in the past. Most of your log files then going to be filled with things like, auto-saving or not auto-saving. When you hit render, let me see if I can find some render error messages. Okay, so this is cut and paste. Again, we've had some issues with cut and paste, so we have a tendency to log what happens when you do a cut and paste. See if there's any rendering going on in this log file or pasting of data. This person's done a whole bunch of pasting of data. Okay, so this also gets logged a lot. So when you start up your show, we do a backup, and here we will log exactly what files got backed up and where they were backed up to. And this person doesn't seem to have any rendering going on that's interesting. Rendering on save. Obviously his render's pretty good. I can tell how long it took to render. Here's a crash. So the crash handler was called and it crashed on get number of strands on some model. I'm not sure what model it was. Doesn't actually tell me that, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important that when you submit a bug that you don't just rely on the crash report, because the crash report really just tells us which function it crashed in, and even then we have to be somewhat lucky. It doesn't always do that. So filling in the text field to say I was trying to do this on this model or something will really help us locate exactly what went wrong. I'm going to switch over to another log file. All right. So the other thing we talk about is you get slow rendering. Well, slow rendering is caused by typically, a frame or whatever being slow. And so what we do is we log any frame that takes more than 150 milliseconds to render. So that's 0.15 of a second. If frames are taking 0.15 to a second, then it's obviously rendering quite slowly. And so here we can see that frame number 3 on the whole house model, which is probably a group, which is set to be 400 pixels wide by 143 pixels high. So it's a reasonably big model, which is probably explaining why it's a problem. using the plasma effect, which is an effect which is quite commonly slow because of the number of calculations that it has to do. At the 0 millisecond mark, so probably the first, so this effect is probably located right at the beginning of the show. It starts at the 0 milliseconds and it finishes 215 milliseconds in, so someone's put a plasma effect probably across most of their show. This took more than 150 milliseconds. Specifically, it took 157 milliseconds. So this probably renders quite slowly and takes a fair while to render. And you can see that all of these are the plasma effect. And so if I was this person and I was frustrated with the rendering time, well, one thing I could do is I could lower the resolution of the whole house model, which means I could go into my layout here, find my, I don't know, I'll pick my, I don't know, my RGB model. And what I could do is I can change this maximum grid size, make it a bit smaller. It won't render as nicely, but that's okay. I can always change it back later when I'm ready to do my house. But if I was to lower that to 200, that would reduce the number of pixels that need to be rendered by a factor of 4 on this model, and it would render a bit faster. And look, when I'm just doing that initial sequencing, that's not the end of the world. It just, obviously, it'll look a little bit grainier than it really would in real life. More pixels would get updated by a single part of the effect, so it would look a little bit blockier. But you can always go back and do it later and fix it up. What else do we have in this one? Not a surprise. Another effect that's running a bit slowly, the galaxy effect, a quite common effect to run slowly because of, again, the amount of math that's involved, and the fact that this works on using radian, so it sort of spins around, and the bigger the model, in this case 400 by 121, the smaller the step size that it has to use, and that just leads to it running quite slowly. While we're here, we'll go into one more log file. This is a log file that has actually been running while we did the demo earlier. You can see that when we load a video, I log all the details about the video, exactly how fast the frame rate is, how big it is, and so forth. This is because every now and then we do run across a video that doesn't render properly or won't open at all, and we can go back into the log file and we can see exactly what was the details of the video and potentially find a way to fix it. So we've been opening the video a fair bit. And with the gladiator effect, it's also logging some duration treatment. These things quite commonly get added when we do work on an effect. We'll throw in some additional things that make sense to log. And you know, if they don't impact on the overall experience, i.e., we try not to log during the render loop. It's okay to log when an effect is first created, but during the render loop, logging can get quite expensive and slow down the render, and so we try not to do that too much. So that's a rough explanation of the log files. So I'm actually going to break the video here because it's a kind of a nice point to break, and we'll come back and we will cover the scheduler.